Hello and welcome to The Game Changers, the podcast that celebrates trailblazing women in sport. I'm Sue Anstis, and I'd like to start with a big thank you to our partners Sport England, who support The Game Changers through a National Lottery Award. I'm delighted to say that this, the 13th season of the podcast, is a serialisation of my book, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. Chapter 7. Equal Pay for Equal Play. Everyone thinks women should be thrilled when we get crumbs, and I want women to have the cake, the icing, and the cherry on top too. Billie Jean King, 2016. A challenge often made to women's sport is whether the quality of play is as good as the men's. Never mind the fact that women are physically different from men, so the very best women may not be able to run as fast or kick or throw as far as the best men, but the widely held belief by many male sports fans that women footballers, cricketers and rugby players do not play with the same level of skill as men. It's an interesting argument, and I've often found myself defending women's sport, citing it's a different game and it's not fair to compare men's with women's. That said, the reality is that until recently, women in these sports may not have had the equivalent levels of skill demonstrated by the men because they've been amateurs, deprived of the chance to play full-time like their male counterparts. With insufficient coaching throughout their careers and inadequate opportunities at a youth level, until very recently, many have only trained a few nights a week, often juggling full-time jobs with playing their sports. How can anyone expect women to play with the skill and experience of men who have been fully professional for decades when this is the case? This is where the development of professional contracts in women's sport is already having a massive impact. In sports where men and women have always had equal opportunities to train and perform, equal access to sports science support and funding, you do not see any difference in the intrinsic skill levels. From triathletes, gymnasts and swimmers through to rowers, golfers or cyclists, the skills of the men and women are equal, with just power and strength the differentiators in performance. It's been a strange history for professional women's sport, as Ali Bowes and Alex Colvin explain in the introduction to their book, Issues and Debates in the Professionalisation of Women's Sport. It was the individual games of golf and tennis that really broke new ground for Western women in sport, specifically in the United States. Initiated in the wake of the second wave feminist movement in the 1950s and 60s, most notably with the formation of the Ladies Professional Golf Association and the Women's Tennis Association, the sports are now considered the most successful, popular and significantly lucrative forms of professional women's sport. The move for other sports, and specifically team sports, to follow this shift towards a professional era has been slow, sporadic and marred with difficulties. As Alex and Ali point out, in terms of individual sponsorship, the sports that have led the way are tennis and golf, with professional athletes such as the Williams sisters, Naomi Osaka and Maria Sharapova earning eye-watering amounts in comparison to many other female athletes. In fact, 9 of the world's 10 highest-paid female athletes in 2020 make their living playing tennis. The only exception is Alex Morgan, co-captain of the US women's football team, who is in 10th place, earning $4.6 million from income and sponsorship. In 2019, Osaka earned $37.4 million from prize money and endorsements, setting an all-time earnings record for a female athlete in a single year. Maria Sharapova previously held the record with $29.7 million in 2015. Serena Williams was the world's highest-paid female athlete in each of the previous 4 years, with an annual income ranging from $18 million to $29 million. During her incredible career, Serena has also collected over $300 million from endorsers. Despite the success of a few female athletes, it is disappointing that in 2020, only 2 women, Serena and Naomi, appear on the Forbes ranking of the 100 best paid athletes in the world. Perhaps this will change in future decades. We live in hope, but across most sports, female athletes get substantially less media coverage, and this in turn makes them less appealing to sponsors. Attempts to establish professional women's sports leagues so that female athletes could be paid to play in the way men are have met with mixed results across the world. Basketball is one of the earliest examples, with the inaugural Women's Basketball League established in 1978. Unfortunately, it only lasted 3 seasons. The 1990s saw the unsuccessful Women's Basketball Association, 1993 to 95, which evolved into the more sustainable and successful Women's National Basketball Association, established in 1997. Even during the sporting hiatus caused by COVID-19, the WNBA has continued to break new ground, with its 2020 draft ratings broadcast on ESPN up 123% on the previous year, with 387,000 viewers and 6.5 million social media video views. On January the 14th, 2020, the WNBA announced new league-wide contracts that would change women's basketball forever. Talking to The Telegraph, Chiney Ogwumike, Vice President of the Women's National Basketball Players Association, commented, "People were calling this agreement groundbreaking. And as I heard it more and more, I realised it wasn't groundbreaking, but ground establishing." Along with much improved salaries, the new terms include employees' rights, better travel conditions, and full maternity pay, plus financial compensation for veteran players involved in adoption, surrogacy, and fertility treatment. A salary cap increase of 30% means players can now earn from $130,000 to $500,000. Still nowhere near in the region of the top men playing in the NBA, where average salaries were $7.7 million in 2020, but a substantial increase which should enable women to stay and play in the US rather than being drawn to Europe. Some of the overseas teams had been tempting players with up to 10 times their WNBA salaries. With a short season for the WNBA, the result was many women competing all year round, risking exhaustion and injuries in the process. In addition to this, there was the emotional distress of being away from loved ones for half the year and the inability to market yourself to sponsors in the US when you're not living there for the majority of the year. Several attempts have been made to professionalise women's football in the US, starting in 2001, when the Women's United Soccer Association was established as the world's first women's football league. All players in the 8 teams were to be paid as professionals, and former England captain Kelly Smith was one of the overseas players included. After just 3 seasons, however, with losses of around $100 million, in September 2003 the league suspended its operations. In 2009, the Women's Professional Soccer League launched with 7 teams and big plans for future expansion. The chance to play professionally attracted many great English players, including Eni Aluko, Anita Asante, Karen Carney, Katie Chapman, Gemma Davidson, Leanne Sanderson, Alex Scott, Kelly Smith and Karen Bardsley. Once again, the league failed to survive, and in 2012, after a number of legal and financial issues, it was suspended. The current professional league in the US is the National Women's Soccer League, which was established in 2013. Learning from the previous failures of professional women's leagues, the NWSL put systems in place to protect its future, including subsidies from governing bodies, lower operating costs, salary caps, and an even distribution of players. With the ability to now play professionally in the Barclays FA Women's Super League, few British players remained in the NWSL in 2020. While the NWSL has so far lasted longer than its predecessors, and the popularity of women's football in the US remains incredibly high after another World Cup win in 2019, driving attendance and sponsorship for the league is still a challenge. To help address this, Budweiser, an NWSL sponsor, launched the #Won'tStopWatching campaign when the US team returned from the World Cup to encourage fans to attend league games. In October 2019, Megan Rapinoe fronted the brand's Future Official campaign to attract new brand sponsors to the league. When the US women's national team returned from France, the next step was making sure fans continue to support women's soccer on a year-round basis. And they answered our rally cry by supporting the NWSL with both record attendance and viewership this year, said Monica Rustke, Vice President of Marketing for Budweiser. Now, with the Future Official Sponsor campaign, we turn to other brands and encourage them to support the league like passionate fans. The NWSL was the first US women's sport to return after the COVID-19 lockdown, and it looked like that momentum from 2019 was going to be maintained. The opening game of the NWSL Challenge Cup broke the previous ratings record, 190,000, with 572,000 viewers on CBS. Houston Dash won the final over the Chicago Red Stars, breaking NWSL domestic television viewing ratings records with a 653,000 average on CBS. Interesting developments in the autumn of 2020 saw a flurry of the very top US players heading to play in the FAWSL when the US season was dramatically shortened because of COVID-19. World Cup winners Rose Lavelle and Sam Mewis signed year-long contracts with Manchester City. Tobin Heath and Kristen Press signed with Manchester United, with their shirts outselling any of the Manchester United men's players for the first weeks after they arrived. Alex Morgan, famous for miming sipping tea after scoring against England in the World Cup semi-final, it made some England fans angry, but I thought it was very funny, arrived to play for Spurs. Jess Fishlock, Wales's most capped player, who's had enormous success in the NWSL at OL Reign alongside Megan Rapinoe, also returned on loan to play at Reading FC. What these players do for the profile of women's football in the UK will be interesting to see, especially when you consider Alex Morgan has more Instagram followers, 9.2 million, than the official Spurs men's account at 8.8 million. Professional soccer also had a stuttering start in Australia, where the Women's National Soccer League initially lasted just 8 years, from 1996 to 2004. In 2007, the W League was established, with all clubs but one aligned to the existing men's A-League team's business model. In 2017, Westfield came on board as the title sponsor of the league, and a collective bargaining agreement that year enabled the W League to remain competitive with player salaries in comparison to other leagues around the world. Since 2015, though, Australia has seen a huge growth in professional women's sport. Along with netball and basketball, the changes primarily occurred in what were traditionally male sports, namely football, soccer, AFL, rugby league and rugby union. In 2018, the men's and women's Cricket Big Bash League finalists received equal prize money and, according to Sporting Intelligence, 3 of Australia's competitions are among the 10 best-paid women's sports leagues in the world, including Super Netball League at number 2, Women's Big Bash League, cricket, at number 8, and W League, soccer, at number 9. So what's the state of play for women's professional sport in the UK? In May 2014, the England and Wales Cricket Board celebrated the dawning of a fully professional era for women's cricket in England as they announced that 18 players had been awarded fully professional contracts. The sports minister at the time, Helen Grant, said it was a significant step, not just for women's cricket, but for women's sport. It demonstrates to girls and women throughout the country that a career in sport is a realistic aspiration for them. Building further on this, and perhaps in response to the success of Australia, who have over 100 women playing professionally or semi-professionally, in 2019 the ECB announced an initial £20 million of funding over the next 2 years to allow 40 full-time professional contracts to be awarded, in addition to the existing 21 England centrally contracted female players. Claire Connor, England's Managing Director of Women's Cricket, said, "Over the last 5 years, Australia have made similar investments which we are about to make. There's no getting away from the fact that we do need to close the gap, certainly around the number of female players who can make a living playing the game." In December 2020, the ECB confirmed the allocation of professional players to the 8 teams within the new women's regional setup, adding a further 16 players to the list of contracted professionals. This means that 41 female cricketers have now signed full-time domestic contracts. The Rugby Football Union have had a mixed record when it comes to their efforts to professionalise the women's game. In 2014, amid much noise and celebration, 20 contracts were awarded to women playing sevens in the build-up to the Rio Olympics. This was then expanded to 48 contracts, including 16 full-time deals for those playing 15-a-side. Uproar then followed in 2017 when the RFU announced it would not be renewing the contracts of the England women's 15-a-side team. The Shadow Sports Minister, Dr. Rasina Alan Khan, along with 124 MPs from across the political spectrum, wrote the RFU to complain about the policy of cycling between contracts for sevens and 15-a-side rugby, as it was unfair to expect the athletes to pause and resume their careers every 2 years. Surely the RFU should be focused on investing in both aspects of the women's game and should be prepared to back this up with secure contracts for both teams, sevens and 15s. After all, this is the commitment the RFU has made to the men's game, she added. It was therefore a cause for much celebration in January 2019 when the RFU finally awarded full-time professional contracts to 28 15-a-side players ahead of the World Cup in 2021. Some of the best players can also earn income from the clubs they play for, though this is limited, with little income for the Premier 15s from rights, sponsorship or central funding. Sadly, this situation changed again during the summer of 2020 as a result of COVID-19. Unlike the ECB, who ring-fenced the money for women's contracts, the RFU cut all professional contracts for sevens players, both male and female, and reduced the funding for the Premier 15s by 25%. Being paid to play netball is the reason why many British players moved across to play in Australia and New Zealand in the past decade. Leagues there benefit from sponsorship and revenues that see average player earnings of around £40,000 a year. The popularity of the sport there also means athletes are more likely to receive personal endorsements. I was lucky enough to visit Netball New South Wales in 2018, and it was fantastic to see massive billboards adorned with images of English players, Joe Harton and Helen Housby, who also appeared on the sides of buses advertising their games. With team salaries in the UK's Vitality Netball Super League capped at £75,000 between 10 players, the semi-professional players would struggle to survive without additional jobs and income. Although Sport England funding had enabled the England Roses to play full-time netball ahead of the Commonwealth Games, in October 2018 it was announced that Vitality would extend its support of England netball, and that as part of that agreement the Vitality Roses were created, ensuring the women could remain on full-time contracts. When it comes to football, for decades the women's game has been an amateur, voluntary-led sport in the UK. Even those playing at national level did so for free, sometimes paying for their kit and contributing to their travel costs for away games. Things changed in 2009 when England put 18 of its top players on central contracts, and there are now 26 England players earning an annual salary, with the WSL teams paying top players too. A slight caveat to this positive news of professional contracts for women in sports including cricket, rugby and football is how much these contracts are actually worth. It's upsetting to learn that in some cases these contracts may only just be above minimum wage. As Hannah Thompson, a doctoral researcher at Loughborough University working with elite female athletes, points out, it's great news that this is happening and certainly something to celebrate, but we mustn't lose track of how far female athletes still have to go towards true equality with their male counterparts. There's a difficult tension to navigate here. The gratitude our sportswomen are expected to show for finally being paid versus the fact that it's about time, as they've waited so long for any change. We need to celebrate the small wins, and it's hard not to be grateful for the fact that things are finally shifting, but we can't become complacent when the amounts being paid are relatively low and incomparable to the men. Being paid is just the start, and it's long overdue. The problem we have now is female athletes having the option to be paid in the sport they've dedicated their lives to, but still on relatively low pay. It's choosing this versus leaving sport to progress in an alternative career, where salaries may be more attractive with better employment rights. When the central contracts were first introduced in football, England players received £16,000. An amount that has now been increased to £20,000. Some might call this laughable, as male Premier League footballers earn more than that in a single day. But Kelly Simmons at the FA says that's not a fair comparison. Men's football is 150 years old and is a multi-billion-pound industry, so I don't really compare the women's game to that. It's about turning what was amateur into a professional sport. The women's game developed further in 2011 when the FA launched the WSL and most teams were predominantly semi-professional. Following the 2017 to 2018 season, the WSL became a fully professional league for the first time with 11 teams for the 2018-2019 season. So there, within the space of a decade, women in this country are now able to play professional sport. Not only does this mean the quality of the sport on display is rapidly increasing, it also gives immense hope and inspiration to young women who can now aspire to earn a living playing the sport they love, just like the boys. Aside from players' salaries in the NWSL, in the US, the national women's football team's battle for equal pay became very high profile in 2019, especially after they won their 4th FIFA World Cup. They'd also won 5 Olympic gold medals. In a lawsuit filed by 28 women's national team players against US Soccer in March 2019, the players sought $66 million, that's £52.8 million, in back pay and damages under the Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. They claimed they had not been paid equally under their collective bargaining agreement in comparison to what the male players received through their deal. The women wanted the same bonus structure as the male players, but US Soccer argued that the women actually made more than the men, both overall and by game average. During the court case, the women's position was strengthened by the vocal support of male players, with the US men's team issuing a statement that criticised US Soccer, saying, "The federation continues to discriminate against the women in their wages and working conditions." There was huge public support for the women's claim. which became amplified further when it was revealed that the lawyers for US football's governing body had made submissions claiming the job of a male footballer on the national team requires a higher level of skill based on speed and strength than their female counterparts. Seriously, in 2020. Unsurprisingly, this statement attracted global criticism, and even sponsors like Coca-Cola, Budweiser and Volkswagen got involved and called out US soccer. This comment was later removed from a legal submission, and the US soccer president, Carlos Cordero, resigned as a result. Despite this, the backing of many high-profile people across the world and the fact that the national women's team were ranked first in the world compared to the men ranked at 22, in early 2020, a judge rejected the claim that the women were underpaid compared to the men. He ruled that the pay case did not warrant a trial. The women's team was shocked by the outcome and have said that they will appeal the decision and never give up the fight for equality. Molly Levinson, the players' spokeswoman, said, "We are confident in our case and steadfast in our commitment to ensuring that girls and women who play this sport will not be valued as lesser just because of their gender." In May 2020, Joe Biden, then the Democratic candidate for the presidency of the United States, declared his backing for the US women's team, tweeting that the players should not give up this fight for equal pay and threatening to withdraw funding from the governing body should he win the White House. To US soccer, equal pay now, or else, when I'm president, you can go elsewhere for World Cup funding. Now that Joe Biden is president, we will watch those developments with interest. At the end of 2020, the two sides finally settled on the working conditions, and it was announced that the United States Soccer Federation would now implement revised policies on 4 working conditions: charter flights, venue selection, professional support, and hotel accommodations to equalise the treatment of the men's and women's teams. Women's footballers are clearly finding their voices when it comes to unequal pay across the world. National teams raising issues about the unfairness of pay and conditions in recent years have included Scotland, Denmark, Nigeria, Puerto Rico, Brazil, Argentina, Ireland, Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, Colombia, Chile, and Jamaica. Some positive news elsewhere in the world comes from Norway, where, since 2017, its male and female footballers have received the same pay for representing their country. In 2019, the Dutch Football Association announced that their national women's team would receive increased compensation for the next 4 years until they reach an equal payout with the men in 2023. Following the FIFA World Cup in 2019, Australia followed suit. In November that year, it was announced that the Westfield Matildas would now earn the same as their male counterparts, share an equal split of all commercial revenue, and that their travel, coaching, and operational support would be brought up to the same standard as the men's. This followed years of lobbying by the women, who had even cancelled a sellout tour of the US in 2015 amid a row about their pay, which the players said was so low it was illegal. In September 2020, Brazil made sporting headlines, announcing that its women's national players would now be paid the same as male players for representing the country. Rogério Caboclo, president of Brazil's Football Association, the CBF, said there is no more gender difference as the CBF is treating men and women equally. What they will gain by conquering or by staging the Olympics next year will be the same as the men will have. This prompted the FA to announce that the England women and men were already receiving equal pay, something that had, in fact, been in place since January 2020. Along with contracts to play professionally, prize money can also make a massive difference to women's sport, rewarding players for the time invested and covering the costs of backroom staff. In 2020, we witnessed both the good and the bad in this area in cricket and football. The 100 is a new format of cricket from the ECB, which was due to launch in the summer of 2020, but because of COVID was postponed to 2021. The new 100-ball competition, which features 8 city-based teams, includes men's and women's events running simultaneously. There was much celebration in the cricketing world and more widely across women's sport, when in March 2020 it was announced that both the men's and women's 100 competitions would offer equal prize money, with a prize budget of £600,000 being split equally between the competitions. Heather Knight, the England captain who will lead London Spirit in the 100, commented, "It is brilliant news. To have equal prize money is a statement by the ECB to put women's cricket alongside men's cricket." Of course, it is wonderful news, and hats off to the ECB for making this commitment. But if we look a little deeper into the 100, in terms of true equality for the female players, there's still quite a way to go. For while the prize money is equal, and the female players will also be treated equally to the men during the tournament in terms of travel, accommodation, and access to sports science support, the contracts for the women playing are substantially smaller than in the men's competition. The players are paid in various salary brackets, and the highest for the women is £15,000, compared with £125,000 for the men. Having spoken at length to the ECB about why this is, I sort of understand the reasoning. In 2019, the ECB launched their ambitious action plan to make cricket a gender-balanced sport. A commitment of £20 million was made for women and girls cricket over the following 2 years, with a potential £50 million over the next 5 years. It is a huge investment that will positively impact everything from grassroots and schools through to the pathway regionally into the national game. I say that I sort of understand because I do appreciate that to attract the male players to the 100, the contracts had to be significant, whereas the current salaries of the female players are only a fraction of the men's. But what an incredible global statement of equality and respect for female athletes that would have been if the ECB, within this radical new format of the 100, had also chosen to be radical in their treatment of their female players. It could have gone a long way towards shifting the historical patriarchal stereotype of cricket. After all, it took 200 years for women even to be allowed to enter the long room at Lord's, with the world's most famous cricket club, the Marylebone Cricket Club, finally allowing female members in 1999. When it comes to equal pay in football, there's one club that's had a significant global impact, and that's Lewes FC, the first club in the world to pay its male and female players equally. I asked Maggie Murphy, General Manager at Lewes FC Women, to tell me more. A lot of people talk about pay parity. It is actually a lot more than that. Yes, our playing budgets are the same, but actually it is about splitting the revenue equally. We have the same marketing budgets, we play on the same pitch, we have the same training facilities. When decisions are made, it is not a case of what do the men want and then what do the women want. It is a case of having everyone around the table and deciding what happens. Maggie's enthusiasm for all that Lewes is doing to help drive equality in women's sport is infectious. In 2019, the club led a high-profile campaign calling for equal prize money in the FA Cup, where the women's prize pool is currently less than 1% of the men's. Let me repeat that. Less than 1% of the men's. Maggie explains why their initiative gathered so much traction and why it matters to the future of women's football. People weren't aware of just how big the gap was until we started talking about it. When we went into our 4th round FA Cup game, we won £2,000. But if we were men, we would have won £180,000. I can win the league with £180,000. I can improve our facilities and our infrastructure. I can provide even better coaching to 100 girls in our pathway if you give me £180,000 for a single game. But we got 2,000. Then the next game, against Arsenal, we could have won £3,000. But the men were set to win £360,000. It's not just the number, it's also the fact that for the men's side, they keep doubling the prize money. But for the women, we are going up in smaller increments. Other arguments made against making this change for equality include suggestions that it might kill grassroots men's football if you took the money away. In fact, Maggie explains, 80% of the men's FA Cup money is paid in the final few rounds, where it's generally the Premiership teams playing. So no impact on men's grassroots football at all. Maggie makes a final, powerful point about investment. We are not blind to the fact that women's football doesn't yet generate as much money from revenue and broadcasting, but then there hasn't been any investment. How can I generate bigger crowds, or how can I go on a marketing drive if I've just won £2,000 in my FA Cup? Imagine what I could do with £180,000. We have this idea that men's football got to be the size it is all by itself, and that is not the case. They have had huge amounts of investment, public money, taxpayers' money, your money, my money, for decades, in the use of public facilities, in the use of public grants. Even Wembley Stadium hosts so many more men's sports fixtures than women's, but it got £120 million of taxpayers' funds just a couple of years ago. So our money is constantly being skewed towards investing in men's football, and we are just getting pennies, and we've got so much potential. We just need to shift somehow. If we agree that the current divide, which is less than 1% of what the men earn, isn't good, but we aren't ready for equal prize money, when should the prize pot be equalled? I'd be willing to have those conversations. OK, let's all agree it's going to be equal by 2040. So what do we do in order to get it up there in 2040? At the moment, there is nothing. No one can think that the current status quo is OK. Let's try to figure out, how do we get to the equal prize money? I have no doubt that more and more women's teams, along with sponsors, media and influencers, will get behind this campaign for equal prize money in the future. There are so many inequalities in women's football and more battles to be fought, but it really does feel like the prize money issue is important because the disparity is so tangible and clear for all to see. In 2020, it was announced that Vitality would be the new sponsor of the FA Cup. Perhaps they will join the call for more equality in funding too. To finish on a more positive note, despite the gaping inequality with the FA Cup and issues highlighted by the US women's football team, prize money in women's football has increased significantly in the past decade. Industry sources say the total pot in 2019 was $30 million compared to just $6 million in 2007. That said, it's still nowhere near the amounts to be won in the men's game, and prize money for the last Men's World Cup was about 10 times that on offer to the women in 2019. Research from the BBC that was published in March 2019 suggests that 83% of sports now offer men and women equal prize money, much improved from the 70% back in 2014. This is obviously fantastic news and a move in the right direction, although some sports like football still have some enormous salary discrepancies. To illustrate this point, a global sports salary survey in 2017 revealed that if you combine the salaries of all the women playing in the top-tier football leagues in England, France, Germany, USA, Mexico, Sweden, and Australia, there'd still be less than the $32.9 million earned by Neymar in his contract with Paris Saint-Germain in 2018. We have some way to go then. Thank you so much for listening to the serialisation of my book Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. If you'd like a copy, it's available in hardback and paperback in all good bookshops and online. The Game Changers podcast is free to listen to on all podcast platforms. Head over to fearlesswomen.co.uk to find out more about all of the incredible game changers I've spoken to in previous series. There are over 100 of them, including elite athletes, journalists, coaches, scientists, broadcasters and CEOs. As well as listening to all the episodes on the website, you can find out more about the Women's Sport Collective, a free, inclusive network for all women working in sport. And you can register for the Fearless Women newsletter, a weekly review of the global developments in women's sport. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter at Sue Anstis. Finally, if you've enjoyed the podcast, I'd be so grateful if you could do two things. Firstly, if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd really appreciate it. And secondly, if there's anyone in your life, at home or at work, who you think might enjoy the podcast, please do let them know about it and help us spread the word about women's sport and the stories of these incredible game changers.